Hello, beautiful people. My name is Emma.
And I'm MC.
And we are your hosts of the G-Forces podcast.
Welcome back.
So, we did end up missing an episode that normally we do a, get ready for the next Grand Prix, and that's usually when we'll do, driver of the week, part of the week, and shop talk, but we're still adjusting for the time change from our vacation, so...
We didn't have the time, honestly.
Yeah.
We do have full-time jobs and dogs, and this is a side project, but sometimes there's just not enough hours in the day. So.
But now we're back, and I think we're going to have our flow a little bit better, so you should likely expect 2 episodes from us a week. And today is our recap of the Singapore Grand Prix, which was insane.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much that happened between... not as much happened during practices, but there were some upsets in qualifying. We saw some unfortunate crashes.
Yeah.
There was just a lot of action. There were lizards. There was sweat, possibly a few tears, but there was just a lot that happened, and I think this was a crazy whirlwind of a weekend, not only for the spectators, but also the drivers and the teams.
Yeah.
Things went really right and really well for certain teams and drivers, and things went real bad and real crappy for other teams and drivers.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of shockers and surprises, but I think also a lot of disappointments. So it was definitely a bittersweet, exciting weekend, but I think highs and lows for the drivers, teams, and spectators all in one.
I think some people are going to probably say that this is the most memorable race of the season because of how insane it was, and just because it was the first time we've actually seen a battle at the front of the track, which normally does not happen. So... For me, since we've been watching, I think it was one of the most exciting races, and we were on the edge of our seats the whole time, it felt like. But strategy had a huge part to play with this race.
I also think that you saw spacings and groupings that we haven't ever seen before.
Yeah.
I also think that a lot of the pre-race interviews were pointing towards Singapore. It is one of the longer courses. We'll get into that in a little bit, but it is one of the longer courses. It can get a little bit sleepy, and so I think the drivers were just hoping for an exciting race and weekend, and I think they got plenty of that.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think it could have gone, 2 hours of racing really sleepy, or exactly how it went today, which was edge of our seats, crazy finish. So lots to talk about, lots of opinions and views to share about all that we saw. So
let's get into the track info.
Where are we? Where are we racing? What's happening? So this weekend was the Singapore Grand Prix. So we've seen a lot of Europe recently, but this one we're throwing into a different section of the world.
Yes.
Very different conditions, different environment, lots to contend with, but let's talk about the track. So the official location is the Marina Bay racetrack in Singapore. The official race name is the Formula One Singapore Airlines Singapore Grand Prix 2023. Lots of words. So a little bit of history on this track. The first F1 Grand Prix was in 2008. So a lot of the tracks that we've just seen are a little bit more historical. You have Monza, that's 1950. You have the Netherlands that has been in it for so long. So this is one of the newer tracks on the schedule.
And all of those ones that MC just mentioned are permanent racetracks, where this one was a street circuit, so it is being done on streets that people drive home to work. Drive home and to work on every single day, so.
Yeah. So the circuit length is 5.063 kilometers, and my dumbass this week did not convert that into miles in my notes. So if you want to look it up, Google it right now, because I don't know that. Emma's quickly trying to do the math.
I'm guessing, well, because a 5K when you're running is about like three-ish miles. So
yeah.
I'm assuming it's around there.
Yeah, so it's a little over, I think, like 3.2 miles.
Yeah.
The number of laps were 62, and the race length, yet again, is just in kilometers, so either do the mental math
I can't
or Google
do this mental math.
But it is 308.706 kilometers. So, again, Google it. Sorry, don't
Figure
know
out the miles on your own.
Yeah, apologies. So the lap record for this course was set in 2018 by someone you will all recognize, Kevin Magnussen. He did this with Haas, and that lap time was 1 minute 41.905 seconds. So quick note, they did change the layout of the race course this year. So like Emma just mentioned, this is a street course. You're driving through the streets, the working streets of Singapore. So not only does that make it rougher on the chassis and just like the car as a whole, because you're dealing with just normal wear and tear of a street that people drive on, but there's also things like construction. And so they changed the race course this year, not only because of construction that was within Singapore that was happening where they would normally put the track, but they also changed it because this is known as a sleepier course. Street courses notoriously are narrower, so they become harder to pass. So I think they wanted to switch it up this year to kind of not only avoid construction that drivers obviously can't drive through, but to make it more fun for the drivers and the spectators. So there were 19 turns, and we had 3 DRS zones this weekend. So DRS detection zone 1 is right after turn 4, and then the activation begins right after turn 5. DRS detection zone 2 is between turns 12 and 13, and then activation is right after turn 13. And then detection zone 3 is after turn 17, and activation is right after turn 19, running another straight to finish straight. The start to finish straight. So, lots of opportunity. The last few races, there's only been 2 DRS zones. This has 3, but it's also one of the longer tracks. So times are going to be slower. It's going to be a longer race. I think this clocked out around 2-ish hours.
Yeah.
So just all around another reason you'll see different DRS zones during different tracks.
So just to note as well, with the street course change this year and there being a longer straight towards the end, a lot of the drivers were actually trying to get the FIA to add a 4th DRS zone right there. They ended up not adding it, but I think if they had, it would have been a different race. I think there would have been a lot more action going on, even more than there already was. I wonder if they'll change it next year. I guess we'll see. Who knows? But
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I know that a lot of times the FIA will try to figure out and discuss DRS zones, but the biggest factor is safety.
Yeah.
Again, like we've said in past episodes, DRS is something that might not always be around forever. We'll see. So yeah, I'm curious if they'll add more. I think the 3 worked out really, really well. I think we saw some good overtakes. But yeah, I don't know. DRS zones are always liable to change year from year, race from race, conditions, depending on weekends. So we'll see next year how many we have. But that is the Marina Bay racetrack in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into some practice qualifying and all of our views and opinions on the race.
There wasn't really much going on for practices this weekend. I feel like the practices were used just to see how the tires were going and how they were reacting with the racetrack. And so the only thing that really happened was we had some wildlife on the track.
Yeah, Singapore has lizards. I know Miami, I believe there are iguanas in Miami.
They're like very big lizards.
But yeah, Singapore, apparently throughout the years, they've had issues with these lizards showing up on track. I mean, we deal with squirrels and stupid birds, but fortunately no lizards. I don't know if it caused a huge issue, but there were kind of every driver, every time they passed a lizard, noticed it.
I think Fernando actually ran over one.
I read something about that, so not sure if maybe that affected weekend performance. But
Maybe that's what hurt his car and why he was struggling a little bit. Maybe that was it.
Yeah, the wrath of the Singapore lizards.
Yeah.
The pundits were absolutely fascinated by it, which I thought was funny. One
of them, I think it was Sam Collins,
knew all of these.
He like knew what kind of lizard they were, knew all the kinds of lizards that are in Singapore. I'm not surprised because he seems very data driven and knows all of these things, so.
Yeah, but other than that, practice was pretty sleepy. I think a lot of teams were using it to not only get the drivers used to the conditions, but also to kind of see how the car is going to drive. Singapore is a very, very humid climate. I think it is probably one of the toughest environments that the drivers face.
Yeah.
They are sitting in those cars and just sweating. And again, this is a 2-hour race. So I think those hour practice sessions were just used for acclimation, but also just to kind of see how the guys are feeling in this environment, but also how the car is. Ferrari did top each practice session, which was interesting, not surprising, but just interesting that they were, the ones that were dominating that practice field.
Well, I found it was interesting and shocking though, just because they were strong in Monza, and I felt like their car had been tailored to Monza, but Monza is completely different from Singapore.
Yeah.
And so going into this weekend, I did not expect them to be fast at all. I was expecting them to have a tough weekend, like come 9th or 10th in the results in the end, and it ended up being a very strong weekend for them.
Yeah, they really powered through, and I think we saw a lot of... I think I was less surprised by the performance of the car and the drivers, and more surprised by the strategic call, because I think notoriously Ferrari's strategy has always seemed to be like 2 steps behind, or they make a decision and it feels like it always leans towards like a wrong choice or one driver. But we'll kind of get more into that when we talk about the race. But not much. Again, a pretty sleepy practice session. Yeah. I don't know. We worked while we were watching, and so...
It wasn't anything crazy.
Yeah, it was just practice. I hate to say that because there is huge importance to it, but
sometimes practices can be really important and they can be really entertaining to watch, but I'd say more often than not, a practice is really just the team getting used to the car and the environment and figuring out tire strategy for the weekend.
Yeah. So.
But let's get into qualifying.
The beginning of Q1 was fairly, not average. Obviously, nothing that they're doing is average, but it was.
Everybody went out there.
Safe. It was clean. It didn't seem like there were a lot of issues.
People were putting in a fast lap. Nothing crazy, and then everybody kind of went into the pit and waited it out as usual.
Yeah, I'm a little. Okay, as a new F1 spectator, as someone who has never been into motorsports until now, I'm a little frustrated by what's happening in qualifying. There seems to just be this pattern, and I'm sure it's strategic. I'm sure, maybe in the last 20 years, this is just what they do. But I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit of like a safe, like I'm gonna sit here and wait it out. And I understand they're trying to save the tires, and I think the tire limits probably have a huge reason as to why they wait those few minutes to do the last laps really fast, why they pit it. But there's just been this pattern of they'll do the first, 10 minutes, and then right as we hit 5 minutes left, they all pit, and then they all come out to do 2 really fast laps. Qualifying is fastest lap, so I guess they're trying to save their tires, but it makes it a little boring. It makes it a little typical. You know, it's not as exciting, and there's a limit to how many guys are on the track right now. There used to previously not be a limit. I don't know if it's because of traffic, but I feel like there ends up being traffic because everyone's doing the same strategy.
Well, and I think Q1 showed us that going into the pit and waiting for the last few minutes to get your fastest lap isn't always the best strategy.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, during Q1, I'd say with 5 minutes left to go or so, Lance Stroll actually...
I think it was less. Because
yeah, it might have been.
It was... People were going to start their last
People
lap.
were starting it, actually.
Yeah. It was probably, within the last minute that Lance Stroll had
a really bad crash. It was the worst crash that we've seen this season since we started watching, and everyone that I could see online said it's the worst crash that they've seen this season. So basically what happened was one of his, I think it was his front tire, one of them came off when he crashed. He went straight into the wall, and he realized that there wasn't a lot of time left, and so he had been trying to push on the last turn, and I think he just lost control and crashed straight into the wall, and the front, the nose of the car was completely crushed.
His car spun out into the middle of the track, but right behind him, because they're all on that kind of
one
chaos
after another
of let me get in the fastest lap. McLaren, Lando Norris
it was Oscar who was actually right behind him, yeah.
Okay, because I know everyone keeps getting which one was which.
So it was Oscar first and then Lando right after.
Yeah.
But Oscar was if Oscar was 1 second closer to Lance, then I think Oscar would have been involved in the crash. But Oscar was maybe a second or two behind Lance and was able to react to it kind of as it was happening.
I mean, it's funny because when you look online, when you see their social media profiles, all of the drivers are constantly doing these reflex tests, and I feel like the only way I can describe it is a bop it, but with lights. It really is. And it's basically they'll just stare at a board and they're just sitting there and they're pressing the lights. It's almost like a mix between a baby and a dog toy.
Or it's like a whack-a-mole.
It's bop it meets whack-a-mole meets, I don't know. But so they're always doing these reflex tests because they're driving at such high speeds. I mean, their cars it's fiber, it's carbon, there's not a ton that makes up these cars. There's no airbags. And so to see Oscar right behind him, I mean, he goes between Lance's car that is spun out into the middle of the lane and his wheel has already broken off, and Oscar goes right between them, and you just see how quick his reflex is.
I think the tire was still moving as Oscar went through it, and then he luckily went through it completely safe, but if he had been there a second earlier, I think he might have actually crashed right into Lance, and it would have been a really bad crash. And then a second after Oscar went through, Lando did as well and was able to avoid it really quickly too. But luckily Lance is okay. The main part of the car, the safety capsule or safety pod, whatever it's called, the part that is built to essentially be indestructible, luckily was perfectly fine, so he was safe. The car didn't roll over at all, so he was fine. And he ended up getting checked out afterwards, and he was doing interviews, so he was relatively okay.
Yeah, he walked away from it, which is the biggest thing, and honestly, at the end of the day, all that matters.
Yeah,
is that he was fine, and, obviously after a crash like that, he's probably going to feel after effects, but it seems like nothing's broken. There's no severity to it, and it could have been.
Yeah. But because of the crash, there's a few drivers who were in the middle of a fast lap who were trying to have a better time, and they weren't able to finish it. So Oscar wasn't able to finish his fast lap, and he actually ended up getting out in Q1. And there's a few other drivers who were trying to get a fast lap in who ended up not being able to and were out in Q1.
Yeah, so Q1, Valtteri Bottas was out, Logan Sargent, Zhao, obviously Lance Stroll, and Oscar, I think, was the biggest contender who was really trying to beat his time, but because he had a swerve at that last minute, I mean, it's a perfect example where certain maneuvers when you're driving can really affect your time and can take off a second or two, and we saw that with Oscar. But yeah, so again, Bottas, Piastri, Sargent, Zhao, and Stroll were all out in Q1.
Well, and the last thing that also happened in Q1, right before Lance's crash, was at the end of the pit lane. When you are exiting it, you're supposed to go, and especially when it's a green light, you can't just sit there and wait. But Max Verstappen was actually sitting there and waiting at the line, and for us viewers and the commentators, it seemed like he was waiting, and he said to his race engineer, like, oh, there's just a lot of, and then stopped talking after that, and GP, his race engineer, was like, oh, yeah, the car is good to go now, Max. And it seemed like GP was covering up for him, trying to make it seem like there was something wrong with the car when there actually wasn't, and he was just waiting because he didn't want to get stuck in traffic. And so because of that, there's a few other drivers behind him that, again, didn't have the time to get that last lap in. So that was a little frustrating to see Max do that.
I think you saw the beginning struggles of Red Bull. I mean, practices you can't really tell. I mean, people are in and out of their cars, but I think Q1 was the first moment where it was like, oh my God, this is not a normal Red Bull weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, Yuki Tsunoda came away with fastest lap in Q1. Max is sitting there blocking traffic. And I don't know. I have mixed opinions about all of the impeding. I think that there were a few fouls and warnings that were thrown out that, you know, it is what it is. But I think the impeding with Max sitting there in the pit lane, it was clearly obvious, and you had Charles Leclerc and George Russell behind him who had to just sit there, who couldn't go past. And if that's your strategy, if you don't want to deal with traffic, I don't know, you're sitting middle of the pack during qualifying.
I personally felt like it was bad sportsmanship.
Yeah, I mean, you have someone who's been the top dog. You have a team who has gone undefeated. Red Bull has won every Grand Prix this year, and I think this was the first race, in my opinion, that we've watched that we've really seen Max and Checo start to sweat, and I think that kind of became where we saw the flaws and the issues that a team that's perfect can feel under pressure.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, so then Q2. Again,
another impeding by Max.
Well, I also think to begin Q2 like Q1, like it sometimes felt like nothing happened until the very end of qualifying.
I feel like most qualifying is like that.
Yeah, so Max then went and impeded Yuki in one of the final runs of Q2, and with the pit exit impeding and then the Q2 impeding, a lot of people really felt that Red Bull, that Max was going to either have seconds added to his time
or a grid
placement. But, I mean, his impeding didn't work because Q2 saw both Max and Checo knocked out, which was the first time that
since 2018
that both Red Bulls or any Red Bulls
that both Red Bulls were because Checo's been knocked out a few times.
Yeah, so that no Red Bull has made it to Q1.
Yeah, Q3.
Q3, yes.
Yeah, it was the first time since 2018 that all the Red Bulls, both Red Bulls were out in Q2, and it was, again, I've said in past episodes, we are not here for the downfall of Max Verstappen.
No.
It's very exciting to see a driver in their prime doing what he's doing. But when there's other things going on and we're able to see kind of a team struggle a little bit, it is interesting. And I think they were just having a really hard time with the car this weekend.
Yeah, I don't think it's an insult to Max and Checo, and I don't think that their performance is like, oh, they're shit drivers. Like,
no.
No, it's one of those things that, one, it adds a different flavor as a spectator. Okay, this is a toss-up. This isn't our normal Sunday, Saturday.
Yeah.
But I also think that, like Emma said, it just seemed whenever we heard any of the Red Bull radios that the car was just, they had done something.
I don't know what they did.
They weren't disclosing it in interviews, obviously. Like,
Red Bull's so secret.
None of them disclosed car information, but it seemed like there was just huge amounts of difficulty. It seemed like they had no grip. They were having tire issues. Like
they were sliding out.
It just, when you see a team like Red Bull, you only expect perfection, and we've only seen perfection.
Yeah.
And we didn't see that this weekend. Again, not an insult to the drivers or even the teams. It's just, holy crap, this is different.
Yeah, well, and I mean, Max was putting in, towards the end of Q2, he put in a fast lap, and he moved up to 10th place, and so it looked like he was going to move on to Q3, but then rookie Liam Lawson, the GOAT, came in and outperformed him and went faster and kicked him back down to 11th, and then Liam Lawson was in 10th place. Just to remind you, it's only his third Grand Prix weekend, and he hasn't even had it wasn't even a full 3 Grand Prix weekends since he came in halfway through the Dutch Grand Prix. But it was insane to see him push out Max, especially in an AlphaTauri where those have been the slowest cars the entire season. And this weekend, AlphaTauri came in with some upgrades that were Red Bull inspired from what they said. And I saw some people joking around online being like, I'm pretty sure Red Bull is regretting giving AlphaTauri those Red Bull inspired upgrades this weekend with Max and Checo being out in Q2. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what a performance to see by Liam Lawson, from being thrown into the car after Danny Ricciardo's accident to, honestly, no one knowing who's going to be in AlphaTauri next weekend. I think he's outshined most, if not all, of the rookies. I think he's someone to contend with, and I wouldn't be surprised if more than just AlphaTauri were talking to him.
I agree.
I think his performance in qualifying and even, his race performance is spectacular to watch, and it's really exciting, especially with the way some of the rookies have struggled this year. I think we have some young guys on the track right now that it's going to be insane when they're in their prime. I think we even got a taste of some of the younger guys winning today, and it's going to be a tight field in a few years.
I agree.
I think it's going to be anyone's game.
I agree. Unfortunately, his teammate Yuki, because he was impeded by Max, he wasn't able to actually get a fast lap in during Q2, so he didn't set a time during Q2 and was in 15th place, unfortunately, so he was kicked out in Q2.
Yeah, so Max Verstappen, Pierre Gasly, Sergio Perez, Alex Albon, and Yuki Tsunoda were all knocked out in Q2. And then Q3 it was tight, but it was it was quiet. Nothing major happened.
Yeah.
I think the craziest thing was the times. The top 5 were half a second. Their fast laps were half a second away from each other between Carlos, who came in pole position, to Lewis, who was in 5th. I mean, it was a tight race, and I think it kind of got everyone pumped and excited for what the race was going to bring,
Yeah, and I think because of the Red Bull dominance this season, we haven't really been able to see Ferrari and Mercedes do exceptionally well. And I think this weekend it brought a lot of hope back to the Ferrari and Mercedes fans. And I'm excited to kind of see what happens for the rest of the season, because I think those drivers in particular are getting a lot more used to the current cars that they have, and I think that was a problem for them. I feel like those drivers for Ferrari and Mercedes, they just had a hard time getting used to the car, and now with the physical circuit that Singapore is, you have to be comfortable in the car, and they definitely proved it. So I'm excited to see what happens for the rest of the season.
Yeah, it was super exciting, and it was, I don't know, I think it was just like a fun qualifying to watch. The top three ended up, like I said, being Carlos in pole position, George starting up in second, and then Charles down in third. It was Carlos and Charles at one point, and then George Russell really came in and showed an incredible speed.
Yeah.
And drive.
Well, and this might be a hot take, but I think George is way more comfortable in the Mercedes car this year than Lewis is. And I think he's got more speed than Lewis in the Mercedes this year.
I also think, I think Ferrari and Mercedes, like you said, I mean, it seems like every practice, the last few races we've seen, there's been nothing but difficulties with the way the car is driving. And I feel like this weekend was really the pinnacle of comfort for them. Like it didn't seem like every comment to their engineers was like, the car drives like shit, or like, I can't do this, or I'm losing. You know, it is such a physical course, and I feel like it is a course that we would have seen all of those holes in how they approach the vehicle. But I think they all came back from summer season and really just like put in the time, put in the work. And there's a lot of focus I'm seeing from both drivers in Ferrari and Mercedes. And I think you're seeing it in a few other guys on the grid. Like, there is a hunger and a drive to do well. And I think it's actually making the top, 10 drivers really, really interesting.
Well, I feel like the times have also gotten a lot closer since the summer break. So the top 10 are finishing a lot closer than they were before. And I know some people are saying that they think next week is going to be a really wild weekend. Some people are saying because Japan is next weekend, or the next race, I think it's next weekend, that course is very similar to Silverstone. And so people, because of how fast McLaren was at Silverstone and how close Lando was able to get to Max with the upgrades that McLaren brought this past weekend, people are thinking that next weekend and Japan, there's a potential that there could be a McLaren win. We obviously don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if the Red Bulls are going to struggle again next weekend. Who knows? But I think it's definitely an interesting qualifying, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. You want to get into the race?
Yeah, let's get into the race. Just to start off, when it comes to the race this weekend, we woke up this morning and found out that Lance Stroll was actually not going to be racing at all today. So he, I think, felt some more injuries afterwards. I think he probably woke up this morning feeling really black and blue, and so he ended up not racing. I also don't think that the team was able to fix the car enough to make it raceable, because if they had enough time to do that, they probably would have thrown in a reserve driver for Lance because of how bad he was feeling. So Lance was not able to race. There was only one Aston Martin actually racing today. And so we started off with 19 cars rather than 20. And I think, what was it? I think it was Zhou started in the pit lane, right?
Yeah, so Zhou started in the pit lane. I can't remember why, but yeah, so there were only 18 cars in the grid with one in the pit lane. I don't know if it was like a gearbox penalty or whatnot. No but yeah, I mean, I think Aston Martin, just really quickly, I think Aston Martin made the best choice. I agree. We also have to remember Lance broke like both of his wrists before the season started. And yeah, I'm sure, as the months have gone by, like, his body is healed, but I don't know. I think a crash like that, you know, if you want to, go watch it. If you haven't seen it, it wasn't the worst, but it wasn't
not
great.
Fun to watch, especially with how many times they replayed it. It was not fun.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's no, like I said, it's bare minimum in those cars. And so, like, your body is going to feel a ricochet like that. So I think it's better, you know, he takes the time as opposed to doing, you know, we've seen drivers get on it, on the track, do like 7.
And then come back in.
And DNF, which I don't think mentally is fun for anyone.
No.
But yeah, it was a bummer, but I think it was the right call.
I agree.
By far. So with that, the race starts, and then all of a sudden, you know, I like to watch, if we watch it through F1 TV in the States, I like to watch the times and kind of where the names are falling. I get really stressed at the beginning it starts because the cars, in my opinion, are too close, and I don't know. I think I get nauseous, but all of a sudden, Yuki's name just drops again. I don't know if, like, he did something and someone, you know, wished bad luck on him, but I am so beyond frustrated with the fact that his car keeps breaking down, like, literally in the first lap.
Well, he had contact with Checo, actually, in that first lap, and so that's what caused him to DNF, unfortunately. I don't know what the universe is doing to him, but it is, like, justice for Yuki at this point. Like, he needs to be able to show that he can perform in the car, and especially with not knowing if he has a seat next year, I just wish the best for him. And then next week in Japan, like, I just want him to be able to do well.
Yeah, I think I'm really frustrated, especially knowing AlphaTauri, I think, is the last team to confirm their drivers for next season. They're the only team to hit their max 4 drivers of a season. And I think that they have 3 contenders right now. I think AlphaTauri is looking at Yuki, Danny Ricciardo, and Liam Lawson. Obviously, I don't think decisions are made on emotion. I think they're made on performance. And that's what's frustrating, is seeing some of these guys just, whether it's the car, whether it's contact, not only Yuki, but some of the other younger guys seem to just not be catching a break. And I think AlphaTauri has some big decisions to make and some big conversations. But, yeah, it just sucks because it feels like Yuki hasn't been able to show a good performance in the last few races.
And I know that he has it in him. So hopefully next weekend's different, especially because next weekend is his home race.
Yeah.
So I'm fingers crossed that everything goes well for him.
Yeah. So the only other thing we wanted to mention towards the beginning of the race was, like, within the first lap, obviously there's the bunch up, and turns can get hairy, but Lewis took this, I don't want to say crazy turn, but essentially he was, I don't know if he was forced, but he decided to go off track, ended up passing, because I think he started in 5th.
He ended up passing George and Lando.
So you had 2 Ferraris up front.
Then George,
Lando, and Lewis.
And then he cut in front into George.
And with him cutting off the track, he cut in front of Lando and George. And all of a sudden, you could just hear, like, within George's radio and Lando's radio, like, is he giving us his spots back? Luckily, I think he waited a lap or 2 merely because of traffic and probably just, you know...
It's chaos off the start. It's easier.
It's bunched up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he first gave the spot back to George, and then I wasn't sure if he was going to give the spot back to Lando, because I'm not sure if they knew who should get that spot or not. And I think the FIA ended up having to say for Lewis to give it back. And I feel like Lewis is pretty good about following that and not giving it a big deal. He doesn't make it into a big deal.
Honestly, and sometimes, I don't know how often they've done it, but sometimes it's just like, I just feel like it's easier for the drivers to give the seat back than have a 5-second penalty or, you know, some, like, warning. You know, it's like, just, you cut corners, you know, handle it the way it should be handled. But in Lewis fashion, it was handled in a perfect way.
Yeah.
So then it was just racing and
a lot of steady, like, there was no movement really. Everyone kind of stayed in the same spot for like the first 20 laps or so.
Yeah, and the one thing to mention too is Red Bull was still in the middle of the pack.
Yeah.
You know, we didn't see this crazy movement off the start.
It is a hard track to make moves on, and that was something that a lot of people were saying after qualifying. The people were nervous about it because they were like Oscar said, because I think Oscar ended up qualifying in 17th. He was like, I don't know, we'll see how it goes. It's difficult to make some moves.
A bunch of them were saying that, and I don't know. I think sometimes like these pre-race interviews is just like you see their nerves. I mean, before races, before performances, like people get nervous, and everyone kept saying it's not easy to pass on. Street courses are narrower, but we saw some crazy movement on the field today.
I think it was a unique race.
I think it was unique. Like, I think it probably doesn't happen every year, and it's notorious, but it's funny because I just feel like certain interviews and certain questions, the drivers will say one thing, and then we get the complete opposite.
True.
On race day.
One other thing to note that happened for those first 20 laps or so. So it was Carlos and Charles who were in 1 and 2, and something that we normally see with Ferrari is Carlos is typically behind Charles, I feel like, or that ends up happening, and Ferrari will tell Carlos to defend behind him so that Charles can get out ahead. And Carlos has been pretty good about doing it without some complaint. There will be comments here and there. Today, they were doing the same thing, but it was opposite. So Carlos was in front and Charles was behind, and they were telling Charles to slow down so that there was a 3 to 5 second gap between him and Carlos so that Charles could defend. And there are a lot of people who I've noticed on social media right after the race were saying that is the reason why Charles had a tough race. I think that it's difficult to say that that's the reason why he had a tough race. I think that that's teamwork, especially when you're in first and second. I think that that's just how it goes sometimes, especially if that one car has more pace than the other, which throughout the race we did see that Carlos had more pace than Charles, especially towards the end. So I think it just happens sometimes. Yeah.
I think that people are really quick to look at the drivers as 1-2. I think that certain people run their teams as there's a one driver, there's a number 1 driver, and a number 2 driver. Now, I think that certain teams have stronger drivers and weaker drivers. But I'm not saying that each one, okay, Carlos is 1,000% the weaker driver for Ferrari. I don't think that at all.
I think Ferrari is one of the few teams that has completely equal drivers.
And if they're not equal, I think every course we've seen has been so drastically different. Whether it's environment, whether it's type of course, whether it's the way the curvature of the course is.
Whether it's literally how that driver is feeling that day.
People perform differently each race. And so I think certain drivers just will have their day where they're number 1, and other drivers just have a day where they're number 2, and that's okay. And I think this need for Charles to be in first place, I understand that you have this deep admiration for this driver, but also realize that they're teammates. They're going to do anything for the team. I think we have seen in the past where there have been moments where, you know, one driver has outperformed the other, but the other believes they're number 1. And that's hurt teams.
Or even when 2 drivers on the same team will compete against each other and crash, like with Mercedes in 2016 with Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton. Yeah. And nobody wants to see that again.
I think there's a big push within Formula One for mental health and mental toughness, and I think one way to just further this idea is, why are you going to pit teammates against each other?
I agree.
You know, I hope that these things were said lightly, but I also think, you know, it's like, I don't know, they're a team. Be happy Ferrari won. You know, I think be happy that the team, be happy that the car is doing well. Be happy that they're they're in this position. So, I don't know. I think people take these drivers to heart, and that's really great. But also,
yeah,
I don't think strategically there's any vendetta or...
I hope not.
Yeah.
But at lap 20, Logan Sargent actually crashed and clipped his front wing, and so there was a safety car that went out, and he was somehow able to drive back to the pit with his front wing dragging on the floor.
Oh, it was terrible.
But at least he was able to go back in and get his front wing changed, and so he was able to go back out. But because of the safety car, everyone who started, the majority of people started on medium tires, and so a lot of them ended up pitting during that time, and they switched to hards. The only people who didn't end up pitting were the 2 Red Bulls and Valtteri. But most people then switched to hard tires, and they were able to still stay ahead of the Red Bulls, and so I think Red Bull was hoping that that was going to be the time that they could get out ahead because they started off on hard tires, but I think there was a big enough gap, and when you pit during a safety car, it's a much faster pit than during the regular race, and so the Red Bulls stayed pretty far behind, like around like 5th or 6th, and then they ended up dropping back because everybody else had new tires, so after the safety car, people were able to pass them. But luckily, again, Logan was able to go back out and still continue racing. I think that was the main thing for that safety car.
Yeah, I mean, watching Logan drive with that front wing underneath his front tire, I mean, it was literally, like, right next to where he was sitting. It was tough to watch. I'm happy that there wasn't a need for the crane or any of the tractors. But, again, Logan, Williams hasn't signed their second driver, but I will say Alex Albon, Williams as a whole, did not have a great weekend.
This course did not suit their car at all. I don't think they expected it to do well.
Yeah, they struggled, and unfortunately we saw that with the front wing issue, but it just seemed like him and Alex were very much towards the end of the pack, so I'm curious to see how they're gonna drive next weekend.
They did, because it's similar to Silverstone, the Suzuka circuit, I think they're going to do pretty well because they did pretty well at Silverstone, so I think next weekend's going to be a much better weekend for them.
Yeah. So then nothing really happens, and then finally, so like Emma said, majority of the drivers come in during that safety car, which was around lap 20, and then finally around lap 40, Red Bull finally pits. Do you remember which tires they switched to?
They both switched to mediums, I think, and because they basically had the opposite strategy of everybody else. Everybody did the first 20 laps on mediums and then switched to hards, and then they did the first 40 laps on hards and then switched to mediums.
Yeah.
But I think they were hoping when they went into today that their strategy was going to help them quite a bit, but it actually, I think, ended up being the downfall of them.
I think they were expecting to go in, get new tires, come out, and then be able to pass everyone because everyone will have older tires. But they came out of the pit lane, and they were so far behind.
They came out at, like, 15th, 16th place.
So then they're just crawling. And I think this is the example of the race where it is hard to pass.
Yeah.
You know, when you don't have that speed. And honestly, the Red Bull just did not have that speed this weekend.
Yeah.
You know? And they were making kind of, I don't know, it felt like they were a step behind all of the strategic decisions. Like, everything was kind of a little chaotic. But yeah, I think once they took that pit stop, it was a slow crawl up.
Yeah. So the next thing that happened was Esteban around lap 44 had a car issue. I think it was something where he wasn't able to shift gears, and it sounded like he couldn't race anymore, and so he ended up DNFing, and at that point a virtual safety car came out. I think it was only out for, I think the virtual safety car timer thing was on for maybe a lap or something, and then it went away. But right after that, that Fernando Alonso actually went off the track and he dropped in place down to like last place or something. This was not his race. This was not Aston Martin's weekend. They definitely struggled. I don't know what's going on with their car, but I'm hoping that for next weekend they can kind of figure it out. I know Fernando can get frustrated pretty quickly, so I'm sure that he's probably telling them all the feedback that he has.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't watch the beginning of the season, but for a team that was pretty strong and powerful at the beginning of the season to, unfortunately, where they are now, it's a big change. It just wasn't, I think, where they are, and I don't think they're going to be happy.
No.
I think there's going to be a lot of frustration. And yeah, so it was weird. It was just a weird performance.
It was rare. I don't think they even had played any of their team radios, so I don't even know what was going on. Yeah, it was weird.
It was just not the Aston Martin that I think we're used to seeing. I feel like, unfortunately, Lance just, when it rains, it pours, and I think it's really been raining on him.
Yeah, this whole season.
So I don't want to say Lance not being in the race was a surprise. I think it was unfortunate. But I think Alonso's performance was the biggest.
Yeah, it was weird.
Yeah.
So then, as we got closer to the end of the race, both Mercedes had pitted for new tires. They both had mediums left over, where most other teams did not, and they did. So they both got some new medium tires, and their plan, I think, was basically to try and use as much of those tires to get ahead as possible. And so the last 5-6 laps between Carlos, Lando, George, and Lewis, it was a nail biter. Like, it was insane. In those moments, I had no idea who was going to win the race, what was going to happen. It was really just who, and I thought it was going to be like, it's so weird comparison. You know, when Lightning McQueen, when he sticks his tongue out in Cars, when Lightning I literally was like, it's going to be the tip of someone's like front nose of their car. That's what's going to come it down to. And
it's just called a photo finish.
Yeah, that is exactly what it's called. I'm sorry.
Or the Lightning McQueen example works.
Anyways,
Emma, are you into Cars?
Cars are some of my favorite movies. Okay, they're incredible. But unfortunately, George and Lewis were catching up at like extreme speed, and they ended up passing Charles.
Yeah. So honestly, the last like 15 laps. So Mercedes pits when Esteban Ocon's virtual safety car comes out. So that was lap 44. There are 62 laps. So they drop down a little bit when they pit, but not as much, because I think the like top
there was like a 15-second gap.
5 to 7 cars. There was a big gap, and you just saw George in front with Lewis right behind him, and they were just booking it through people.
Yeah.
And so you saw Carlos in front. You saw Lando right behind Carlos. It almost seemed like they were teammates on McLaren again, because the way Carlos and Lando were defending against the Mercedes was insane. And I think, honestly, the reason why it was this nail-biter, I mean, this is normally the fight that we've been seeing for third place.
Yeah.
But we're now seeing it for first, second, and third. Because normally Max is 15 to 25 seconds ahead. That these are the guys that we've been seeing that have been in that third place position, and they're finally showing this incredible performance right at the beginning of the pack, where, like Emma said, we don't know who's going to be in first, where normally we're like, oh, who's going to finish third?
Yeah, I agree. But Carlos and Lando, so Carlos actually ended up slowing down for Lando, so that Lando was in the DRS zone, so that he could use DRS to catch up to him, but also defend from George and Lewis. And one of my favorite moments of the race was when Carlos's race engineer was like, Lando is in 0.8 of a second of you, and Carlos was like, yeah, I did that intentionally, like, so that Lando could help me defend. So it was really nice to see them help each other. even though they're not teammates anymore. That's the kind of sportsmanship that I love to see, because it's like both of you want to do your best, and I think Carlos knew that if he didn't have Lando defending, then he probably wouldn't have ended up winning, and so it was strategic even though they weren't even teammates.
Well, and I don't think, some people might be like, oh, well, that was safe driving, Carlos was making the safe decision with that, keeping Lando in that DRS zone, but I think that Carlos was driving smart. You saw this strategic power that we haven't really experienced before in the calls that he was making.
Yeah, and as a driver, to see him make those calls rather than his team, it was really interesting to see. But unfortunately, in the very last lap, George ended up crashing, and so Lewis ended up getting third, Lando got second, and Carlos got first. It was really sad to see George crash, because the two Mercedes in the top 10 would have gotten constructors points, and that was probably the best performance that they've had all season. So it was very upsetting to see that happen, and I know George was hoping for a win, and to see him crash in one of the last turns of the race, he was crying afterwards, and I felt so bad.
Oh my god, it was the second he crashed, it was probably 15 seconds from them all crossing the finish line. I got emotional.
Yeah.
We've been watching this for 5 Grand Prix, and I'm sitting there getting emotional over someone who does not know me. There was so much excitement, and then to see this him crash fully into the wall. I mean, he was safe. It looked like his brakes were on fire, but yeah.
I think we will finish this up in our final thoughts of the race.
Yeah.
There was a lot that really happened in this race, and I kind of want to take a second to talk about the post-race interviews, because I think, like we were saying when we were just discussing the race, I think George's crash was really upsetting to see, and his post-race interviews were even more upsetting. I think he felt like he let the entire team down, and I think he almost started crying in a Sky Sports interview afterwards. He blames himself, and I think it was an honest mistake, because there was one thing that I saw. He made a comment. He was like, "What? How could I make that mistake? What am I, a rookie?" I think he's being a little hard on himself because of how close he was to a podium. It happens. I mean, Lando ended up brushing the same wall that he did. Just George, I think, hit it a little bit harder than Lando did.
Yeah, there was one interview with F1 that he was basically saying that it was a few centimeters was the issue. If it was a few centimeters less, a few centimeters more. And I understand, we're all our own biggest critic, and I'm sure it's because of points and just performance, and probably just the fact that, these guys damaged the car, and it's a ton of work for the teams, which is probably, I'm sure, a bit of guilt too. But, oh my god, what a performance. I know it's not the results he wanted, but like you said, it was a nail biter. It was so exciting, and he, in my opinion, if he hadn't crashed, I would have been shocked if he hadn't tried to pass Carlos and Lando at the end.
Yeah, I agree.
I think if he hadn't been affected, we would have gotten that photo finish.
I agree.
That Lightning McQueen tongue, and it was such a bummer because he was so close.
Yeah.
But it was heartbreaking. It was not a hard crash to watch in the sense of safety or anxiety. It was a hard crash to watch just because it was heartbreaking.
It was also like we said at the beginning of the episode, this has been 2 hours of racing, and he's in the middle of the very last lap, and he pushed everything he could out of the car, and to crash at the very end, like, it's got to be so frustrating because in his mind it's probably like, well, this was a waste of a day. I just spent 2 hours busting my ass to not even get a result from it. I'm sure he's frustrated in that sense.
Oh, and the mental fatigue. I mean, it's a night race. These guys are tired. It's been a long weekend. They all agree it's the toughest environment any of them are in. And then to crash in the last lap when you're so close to finishing and to possibly finishing on top, none of us are sitting there. None of us are in his head. But if we could talk to one of them, it'd be like, don't be hard on yourself. Look at the performance that you did, because it is an outstanding performance, and I'm excited to see what next weekend's going to bring.
I agree.
I think look at the positive, look at the speed that the Mercedes has gotten from when we started watching to even from the beginning of the year, and I'm excited to see what they're going to do. Yeah. They didn't get the Constructors' Cup points, and it wasn't the result that they probably wanted, but it was a hell of a performance.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other interviews that you want to talk about?
I just want to talk about the fact that, and I know we talked about him earlier, but Liam Lawson scored points. And K-Mag.
Yes.
We saw some points for Haas. It was really exciting to see points for AlphaTauri and for Haas.
We actually, in the post-race show, Will Buxton mentioned with Jack Doohan, actually, he had pointed out that at one point towards the end of the race, Alex Albon and Checo collided because Checo basically crashed into him. And so I'm pretty sure Alex Albon went to the FIA, like all the stewards afterwards, to try and protest it, because if Checo hadn't crashed, then I think Alex Albon was like 4 places ahead of him, and then Checo hit him and then caused him to drop down so much. And right now, based on where people finished, Alex Albon finished 11th, so that means he didn't get points for Williams, but if Checo ends up getting penalized and moved back, then Alex might move up and might get points. So those points in the bottom teams in the Constructors' Championship are just teams and those drivers for the bottom teams. They need those points to do well.
Well, also,
and it's so close.
Also, Checo came in 8th. He drops down. Red Bull doesn't get those points.
Yeah.
And so...
It's a huge deal.
It's a big deal. It was funny because leading up to the weekend, the F1 Instagram account was putting out all of these graphics about how many points or what are the 2 scenarios that could happen this weekend that would automatically cause Red Bull to win the Constructors' Championship.
They were wild scenarios. So going into it, I was like, this ain't going to happen.
It was like Mercedes has to crash and burn and not even show up. Obviously, that's dramatized, but it was like...
It was something like that. It was absurd.
It was like Mercedes doesn't even... I don't know. Go check out the Instagram page. It was just some like wild goose chase of a pose, and I understand it's that excitement of like, holy crap, they can make this decision now. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting going back to Liam Lawson. I think it's interesting that this is a guy who's been in the car for 3 races. And again, I think his performance coming in 9th place, I mean, he's right behind a Red Bull, and he's in an AlphaTauri, I think that this weekend shows that whether it's with AlphaTauri or another team, he deserves a seat next year. At the very least, a reserve driver seat with the potential of a contract for the next year, because right now he's showing more as much as I want Logan Sargent to succeed, Logan's had an entire season so far to try and score points. And now Liam has come in, and it's his 3rd race, and he scored points. And the AlphaTauri has been a worse car than the Williams. And so it's just, he's showing that he is an incredible driver, and I think that he deserves a spot potentially over some other drivers. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's a bad... this is life. You're in a very small, restricted pool of people.
There's only 20 seats.
There are 20 seats currently on the field, and I think that these drivers, the younger drivers, go into it. You have to go into this knowing that nothing is guaranteed.
Yeah.
And I think that goes for just as well as, like, the older guys.
Yeah.
And so I think our wild harebrained theory, and I don't think it's that wild, is I wouldn't be surprised if there are conversations happening with AlphaTauri, if there are conversations happening with Williams. You know, I don't know who's going to be in what spot. I think if there is a conversation with AlphaTauri, I think that there's conversations happening with Yuki, Danny, and with Liam. But a lot of people, he's become a fan favorite. He's blowing up online.
He's very calm and collected, and it seems like the pressure is not getting to him. And I think we have just seen the beginning of him.
Yeah.
If he doesn't get a seat next year, he will 100% get a seat the year after that, because next year during silly season is when a lot of the drivers' contracts are up and they're going to be looking for new places to go or re-signing with their teams. And I think that's when, if he doesn't get a seat for next year, he'll be signed for the year after.
Yeah, I'm a little bummed right now because I don't think we're going to see him next weekend. But they technically have 4. Really, they're probably only talking to 3 drivers.
Yeah.
It's anyone's game who's in a car next weekend. But I have a sneaking suspicion we'll probably see Danny Rick make a comeback.
Yeah, I think next week he'll be back.
So, I don't know. I don't know if we're going to see him race again this season. But he's become someone like him, Oscar, Lando, all of these guys in, like, their early 20s. Granted, like, they're all in their early 20s, but, like, the earlier 20s. I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of passion, and I think you're seeing that almost strategic obsession that people associate with Max. I think you're seeing it in these younger drivers where there is this drive to be strategically perfect, but also to just have the perfect race. And it just seems like they're learning from everything.
Yeah.
Their race interviews are so informative. Like, I don't know, there just doesn't seem to be this kind of ego attitude. And obviously you're seeing them in interviews or they're trained in PR, but I'm excited to see, you know, these younger guys shine in the next few seasons. Who's gonna be where and in what car and what position. But yeah. I think that's kind of my last take is just I'm bummed because I don't think he's going to be racing next weekend, and it's been exciting. He's been a toss-up.
He has.
You know?
Yeah.
He was the leading Red Bull car during qualifying, and that was his 3rd time in an F1 car for a qualifying race. So,
and it's all because of Alex Albon's appendix.
Oh my God, Emma. If you want to know more, just let us know, and I will explain next.
Oh,
next
I will
episode.
go all in depth on it.
Yeah. You're 5 degrees of separation, 6 degrees. But yeah, that's all I really have. Do you have anything else?
I think you pretty much covered it. I'm excited for the few teams that normally don't get points, that some of their drivers were able to get points, and I'm interested to see what happens next weekend, because since Silverstone happened, I think we've had some mix-ups on results, and since next weekend so similar to Silverstone, I wonder if we're going to have a similar result or if things are going to be a little different. I also think that there's probably some teams that are going to bring some new upgrades, so it's going to be a toss-up for next weekend.
Yeah, I think it's anyone's game. The theory I've seen is that Red Bull's going to be back on top.
I still want to know what happened to their car and why it was so bad this weekend.
Yeah, I mean...
really, to be honest, it wasn't bad. Max ended up in 5th or 6th or something. So at the end of the day, it wasn't that bad, but it took until they got the medium tires for them to actually catch up to that point. So I don't know what was going on, but knowing Adrian Newey, he's probably going to read all of the stats this weekend and figure out everything.
They're already working on the car. I can
probably.
guarantee you. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to say I like hope Red Bull isn't at the top, but I think it just be kind of fun to watch if they weren't, which sounds terrible, but the gaps that they've been creating have been so large that, you know, the pundits, the cameramen, they're not even focused on Max anymore.
Yeah, we don't really even see Max in the race.
And so I also think it was kind of cool to see Max in a high stress situation.
Having to pass.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, some people might not like him. Some people have their issues with him, but I also think he's a fantastic driver and really fun to watch.
I think he's going to go down as one of the best of all time.
And that was the thing. I think it wasn't the position he wanted or the placing he wanted, but they made him work again.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes everyone needs that.
Yeah.
You know, I think it can be humbling and also really kind of bringing some people down to earth. And I think Red Bull, while they've been, you know, they haven't been outright terrible about celebrating their records and their wins this season, I think it's just nice to see other people on top.
Yeah, I agree.
But
I think that is all for today, so we will see y'all next time.
Yeah, see you guys soon.
All right, bye guys.